So I'm Dr. Betty Lynxleg. I'm from Tootnau-Izibing Treaty Reserve, which is in Treaty 4 territory of Manitoba. I work as a researcher. The gap for First Nations schools is quite a bit different from the provincial schools. Overall, each student receives approximately $5,000 less than they would in the provincial system, which causes a lot of disparity within the education system locally, even systematically, because First Nations do not have their own school division. They have no ministry. They have really basically the Department of Aboriginal Affairs that dictates all the policies and programming for the First Nations schools. The only control First Nations schools have at this point is administrative control. With the funding gap, there is a lot of disparity within our schools. You'll see our schools are not maintained or not at par as provincial schools directly because of funding. The facilities are need repair a lot of times. We need new schools. Sometimes the students are put in temporary placements because of issues with the facility. That's directly due to funding. Curriculum development is also a piece that needs support and needs that extra funding because language and culture is not supported through the provincial system like it would be at a local controlled school, where we could have immersion programs, where we could have cultural integration, where we would have our traditional knowledge infused right through the school system. With the funding gap, we can't do all of those things. Very limited in what the schools and the teachers can do, very limited in what the students can learn. We learn through the provincial curriculum, and that doesn't have a great deal of opening for culture and language, traditional knowledge, and land-based teachings from our elders, our traditional knowledge keepers. So the kids are losing their identity. They are they desire it very much. They want it, but the school system at the local control just can't deliver it because the funding disparity causes that gap. And with the provincial system, they have all kinds of systematic levels in place, whereas First Nations don't. We don't have a minister that we can set our own guidelines. We don't have a support system that can help educators to deliver those kinds of programs. And for students, it means that they miss a big piece of their identity in that learning process. As First Nations people, we believe in lifelong learning, and we believe that learning comes from birth to death, and that every chance we have to learn, that we should be doing that. We've been traumatized by the education system historically, and there's still a lot of mistrust with it. However, as we gain or reclaim our right to education, we also need the federal government to respect our right to education and how we educate our children on our terms, and to indigenize our curriculum, and to bring our language back to immersion, and to bring our children back onto the land so that they can reconnect with their identity, their culture, their heritage, and regain their pride in who they are. And that's the biggest piece, I think, that's connected to the funding gap is the identity of the students. It's missing because we just can't do the programming, and the federal government doesn't provide that equality as the provincial system. And so we see our students falling between the gaps. Whether that's academically, socially, spiritually, all of those elements of their total well-being. We need a holistic system and funded properly so that our students can regain who they are as a people, and so that our nationhood comes back fully. And that the start of it is to have equality of funding. In this day and age, we shouldn't be having protests to be equal in this country. We signed agreements when the newcomers came to this land. We agreed to share the land. We agreed to, in friendship, to live in harmony. But we don't see that today, and we see our people struggling and our youth struggling. And if we could get back to where we were, I mean, in long-term vision, we would see our people strong. They would be in the workforce. They would be holding their families in strength. There's all kinds of things that they can do. But it goes back to having their proper instructional resources. It goes back to having curriculum development that's developed by the communities. There's absolutely no shortage of will or desire to do those types of things, but it's the funding that really stops us from getting to that point. And if we could see the equality come into place, you would see First Nations people thrive. You would see our students, stand up. You would see them in the workforce. You would see that pride build. It would be amazing if only we could reach equality in this country. Systematically, the gaps are at the governance level. Most local control schools don't have a school board. The school board has now become the chief and council system because of funding gaps from the Aboriginal Affairs. We had at one time funded education authorities that drove the policy and programs at the local level. That has now all just about disappeared. At the administration level, most of the First Nation schools have combined two positions directly because of funding disparity. The director of education position along with the principal position has been combined, which is a dual role and which puts a lot of burden on the school administrator. It's a lot of pressure to do both roles. So that's a funding area that also needs to be looked at. Within the classrooms, the teachers are short of supplies. That's just a basic reality in First Nation schools. I know a lot of teachers that bring in pens, pencils on their own, supplies, because the First Nation doesn't have the right funding. And they can't get all the art supplies, or they can't get the phys ed supplies, or they can't get the extra instructional tools that they need for special ed students or students with disabilities. They can get some things, but it's not equal to the provincial system by all means. We don't have access to consultants. We don't have access to a ministry. We don't have access to a system. The only system for local control schools is the Chief and Council and the Department of Indian Affairs. We need our system developed so that we can have those immersion programs. We can support teachers in the classrooms. We can help them with instructional resources or guiding them on what curriculum supports they would need to reach the outcomes for student learning. Students come in sometimes hungry. That's a reality. We have problems with breakfast programs. We have to fundraise for everything that we do. We don't get grants. There's no such thing as a grant in First Nations education. There's no grant system where we can apply to the Department of Education and get some extra funding for a program. That doesn't exist in the Department of Indian Affairs. We get one base funding and that's it. And the First Nation has to budget and control that funding and try to provide all the programs that a provincial system would deliver, which is unfair because their gaps are there, they're real. We have a history within this country that has affected our people to a degree where we're struggling to maintain, but we're coming back. We're reviving, and through our own efforts and our students' desires to move ahead in life, it's coming. But if we could have that funding equality, we could actually see students coming to school with breakfast programs, maybe a lunch support, extracurricular activities, maybe doing something more than just what the provincial curriculum. They could do crafting. They could learn from elders. We could have elders in our school and being our guidance counselors. We could take them back onto the land and remember our traditional way of life. These are all things that are important for our people, our students. And if we don't want to see students in gangs, or we don't want to see them in a dysfunctional life, we want to see them thriving, we want to see them becoming that good citizen in Canada, then we need equality, and we need the funding gap to end. I think all Canadians should care about every citizen in this country. First Nations people gave up a lot for everybody to come and live here freely and a democratic system, and we don't see the equality. Every Canadian should care about every other Canadian. First Nation citizens are left, I would say, behind. We are behind the system. We are almost the forgotten people in Canada. Why are our students left behind? That's my question. I care about this because I have my grandchildren coming. I see children in the street. I see children desiring to know who they are. I see them wanting to progress as a person, as a citizen. I see them wanting to have a career, to have a good life. And how can they do that without equality? That's why I care.